I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Within these last hours, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, telephoning the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. Not the hotline, but the diplomatic line. However, there is heat in this conversation in two directions. The immediate at hand for the President, we're told, is Sochi. The Sochi Winter Games, the President not attending, nor is the Vice President. In any event, the President offering, we're told by the White House, assistance in the rumors of black widows, that is, Chechen or other widows of the Chechnya War, launching suicide attacks against citizens in Sochi. The Olympics are planned to open within days, but they're gathering now. That was ostensibly the call. There were other issues, however. Syria is at hand. Geneva II begins within moments in Switzerland to discuss the Syrian civil war, the Russian part in it. There is the ongoing conversation about the suspect nuclear weapons program in Iran, the sanctions regime now suspended for a 6-month interim period. But the presenting heat right now, and I welcome Steve Cohen, professor of Russian history at NYU, is Kiev, Ukraine, the near abroad. Within these last hours, the report is 2 protesters shot and killed during clashes with police in Ukraine's capital, Kiev. The leader of the rebellion, so-called, is a man named Vitaly Klitschko. He's described as a boxer turned politician. Tough words giving to the media. The police are preparing to clear us out of Independence Square, he says. We must do all we can to stop them, he says. If I have to go under bullets, I shall go there under bullets. Immediately, Canada and other countries are looking to impose sanctions on Ukraine unless there is a peaceful resolution. Professor, a very good evening to you. You have long instructed me that Ukraine is a vital decision for Vladimir Putin. This is one that he cannot lose. Right now, this threat of sanctions looks to be new pressure from the West. Vladimir Putin is not the cause here, but he is being looked to for the solution. Kiev, what is the argument right now as we understand it? This Mr. Klitschko challenging the president of the country.
Well, Klitschko is not just some boxer. He is the recently retired, long-standing heavyweight champion of the world. He's a very famous man. He is a Russian-speaking Ukrainian, but who has lived, at least for tax purposes, in Germany for many years, and now intends to run for president of Ukraine in 2015. So whatever his inner nobility may be, he's running for president in the streets of Ukraine, of Kiev now. The question is, what has happened in Ukraine? I don't understand the threat of sanctions. A month or so ago, the president of Ukraine had to decide whether to sign an economic relationship with the European Union or accept an aid package from Russia. He accepted the aid package from Russia for the simple reason that the European Union was not giving him anywhere near enough money to save the Ukrainian economy, which is melting down. He did that. The West was terribly disappointed. As a result, the protesters who favor that Western segment of Ukraine, which favors a relationship with the West, not with Russia. We've discussed before, John, Ukraine is at least 2 countries, one Russia-leaning, one Western-leaning. The Westerners have stayed there in the square. Then Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, passed some laws banning certain types of opposition in the streets. Whether they were rightful or wrongful, I don't know, but now the right wing, the nationalist wing, some people call them semi-fascist wing, of the Ukrainian opposition in the streets, has begun throwing Molotov cocktails, rocks, asphalt, setting fires, and directing this at the police. This began last weekend. So the question becomes, how would any Western government, democratic government, react to violence by street demonstrators directed at the police in their capital city? And we know the answer. They'd strike back with force. Yanukovych has struck back with a minimum of force, and the West is saying now, we will bring sanctions against you for your behavior. And yet, Western representatives had played their role in agitating this crowd in the street, not paying any attention to the fact that right-wing ultra-nationalists were taking charge. That's not Klitschko. He's one of the moderates, taking charge of the movement. So we have a situation tonight where the West, which is deeply complicit in the violence in the streets, having played its unreasonable role of interfering in Ukrainian politics, is now standing back saying, we have no blood on our hands, we are innocent, and we will sanction the government of Ukraine for its actions. This is sanctimony of the worst kind. That's where things stand. The Washington Post took it even farther today in an editorial and blamed Putin for all this. But that's just more of the Washington Post blaming Putin for everything that happens in the world. But it's very serious now. And the problem is not only because Ukraine is on the verge of a kind of civil war in the streets, but that as this Western-Russian standoff grows into a full-scale confrontation, it spills over and spoils the opportunities for cooperation in Syria, Iran, and at the Sochi Olympics. And the telephone call between Obama and Putin today is meant to offset that. But let's end by reminding ourselves, just turning to Washington, that there is a lot of opposition in Washington to Putin's attempt to cooperate, Obama's attempt to cooperate with Putin, including major opposition in his own party.
I want to stay with Vladimir Putin and the risk for him, Steve. You have these years said that Putin must win this, that Russia must win this, that Kiev cannot be separated. Ukraine cannot be separated from Russia economically, culturally, spiritually, cannot be separated. And the last time we talked, it looked like it had been solved with cash. Yanukovych had quieted the protests from overseas. There is the suggestion that there's skullduggery or prankishness from some Western countries, not the least being Poland. But in any event, it looked like Yanukovych had the upper hand. In these last weeks, what happened? Did Putin lose his advantage, or is this just what you'd have to say a repeat of the earlier protests, and they're doing it spectacularly now that they're dead?
It's not a repeat in the sense that the original protests, which stretched back now many weeks, were by and large peaceful. There was very little violence on either side. There was some, but very little. Now we have Molotov cocktails, right, bombs essentially being thrown, rocks, 100 or so policemen injured.
Lots of video, lots of cameras, lots of media. They're staging it just like Tahrir Square in the front of the European television audience.
So the question becomes, analytically, who's responsible for this escalation in the streets of Kiev to violence? The short answer is, according to all reports, this has been provoked on purpose by the ultra-nationalist wing of the opposition for its own purposes, to raise the stakes, to bring down Yanukovych, to shut off the opening to Russia. Were they encouraged by the West? My guess is they were not overtly encouraged. Nobody in Western authority said to them, why don't you throw Molotov cocktails? But they observed that during this whole 2-month period of opposition, the West has supported the opposition in general, without distinguishing among Democrats and semi-fascists. So much so that people like Senator McCain went to Kiev and stood in the streets with the ultra-nationalist leaders and encouraged the crowd, as did a woman named Nuland from the American State Department, as did officials of the European Union. So if I were a hardline, violent-prone, ultra-nationalist in the streets of Kiev, I would be saying to myself, I've got protection in the West. I can do what I want. And that's why I say I think the West is complicit in this. As for what Putin may gain or lose, he wanted none of this. The last thing he wants is violence in Kiev. But it's not in his control. He didn't provoke the violence. All he did was bail out the Ukrainian state. And American officials who lament this should ask themselves, what would have happened if Putin had not bailed out the Ukrainian economy? It would have meant destitution for millions and millions of ordinary Ukrainian citizens for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. What's going on in the austerity-ridden countries of Europe? Is that what we hope for Ukraine? And what do we think that would lead to? What kind of government would that lead to power? The West is playing with fire that it doesn't even understand. Metaphorically, in Ukraine, and now that metaphor has become a reality as part of Kiev is now burning in the streets.
Coincidences, just pile them up here quickly. Within these last days, two powerful chairmen in the House of Representatives, the head of Homeland Security and the head of House Intelligence, have accused Russia of controlling and being mastermind of the Snowden penetration of the NSA, leading to revelations that have many implications. I'll leave that on the table. In addition, we have the Sochi Olympics, the threat of violence, the president turning his back, the vice president turning his back, advising Americans not to attend. And then we have Iran invited to Geneva 2 and then uninvited to Geneva 2. And now we have the protest in Kiev. It perhaps is just independent action, Steve, but it does look like a pattern here, putting pressure on Vladimir Putin. To what end? What do they want from him? If he was ready to concede anything, what would look like enough for these odd coincidences?
If you read Western commentary on the forthcoming Olympic Games in Sochi, much of the commentary, not all of it, but too much of it, is framed as follows. Putin has staked everything on a successful Olympic game.
And spent a lot of money.
If he succeeds, he will have restored Russia and himself in the world. If he fails, that would be a good thing because we hate Putin. What would failure mean? And then the conversation turns to the danger of terrorism. I find this despicable. Now, switch to Washington. The White House should have done this after the Boston bombings. But at last they understand that these people who bomb Russia, who are threatening to bomb Sochi, would be happy to bomb the Super Bowl as well. They don't see any difference between the Russians and the Americans. It's just that they live in Russia, so the Russian targets are closer. So the cooperation between the American military and the Russian intelligence forces is apparently now underway. A lot of it's technical. Apparently it'll be useful. But I thought what General Dempsey, whom I think is head of the Joint Chief of Staff, I'm not sure, said about this cooperation yesterday, he said this cooperation against terrorism must exist insulated from any political differences the two countries have. And he's absolutely right. But that's not a political reality in the United States. And once again, outwardly at least, we don't know the inside story, Obama does not appear to be a resolute leader.
We will continue this when we come back. The president's call to Vladimir Putin, the offer of aid with the FBI, and the appeal of Geneva 2 starting within hours over Syria and Iran. Steve Cohen, Professor Steve Cohen, Russian history at New York University. I'm John Batchelor. I'm John Batchelor. Steve Cohen, professor of Russian history at New York University, is here. The burning issue is Kiev, the threats and the challenges for the governance of Ukraine and Vladimir Putin and what is to be done. However, I want to grow the story here because we're looking at two continents, Europe and Asia. Steve, I've watched for several years now the development of a striking relationship given the 20th century. Berlin and Moscow, Putin and Merkel. Close working relationship, we're told, these last years, especially since 2009. But now, my understanding is these two powers represent the future for others, including Paris and London, turning away from NATO as an antique of the Cold War, including the United States, turning away from the literal states of Europe, that is, those that border the Atlantic Ocean, and turning towards the Eurasian landmass. Does that suit Vladimir Putin? Does that suit the future for Russia?
It certainly would suit Putin, but let's deconstruct that. You're absolutely right about the special relationship, between Moscow and Berlin. It's historical, it's economic, and it's abetted by the fact that Putin himself is a fluent German speaker. Lived in Germany when he was a KGB officer before the end of the Soviet Union for many years, has an affinity for Germany, and has established over the years a good working relationship with the top political officials in Germany, including Merkel. The growing relationship between Berlin and Moscow has, in many ways, offset for Russia the conflicts with the United States. However, that relationship has been somewhat tattered in recent years as opposition to Putin's political behavior inside Russia has grown. Merkel has clung to him, but less adamantly. Now we have a new factor. You mentioned early Vitaly Klitschko, the heavyweight boxing champion of the world, who is a candidate for the presidency of Ukraine in 2015 and now a leader of the street protest. Klitschko lives in Germany. He's a tax-paying German resident or citizen. He's a German speaker. He has been promoted by German forces for the presidency of Ukraine. So, to a certain extent, he's the German candidate. That complicates things. Now let's bring this back to Merkel, Putin, and Obama. We're at a turning point, John. There's an opening, an American-Russian opening in Syria. There's an American-Russian opening in Iran. There's an opportunity for the United States and Russia to work together to protect Sochi against terrorists, thereby sending a message to terrorists everywhere, from Afghanistan to the Middle East to the Caucasus, that the United States and Russia stand as one. It's kind of a historic moment. Kiev's getting in the way. Ideally, Merkel would throw her considerable political weight behind this U.S.-Russian cooperation, that she would say to Obama, here is your opportunity. Reach out and seize it. And she would tell her friend Putin at the same time, when Obama reaches out, embrace it. I think that Putin's fully ready to embrace this. The weakness, the wavering, is coming from Washington now, and it's very dangerous.
I connect this to Snowden. Just an anecdote. One of the telephones, the smartphones that the president's NSA is said to have tapped in on is Angela Merkel's. And I've heard it said, it's a rumor, that the president was not unaware of this and has now promised no more of that. That means, of course, that he's fully apprised of the relationship between Angela Merkel and Vladimir Putin.
Yes.
I don't know if he's listening into their phone calls right now, but he might be, Steve. So this is not a relationship that is trusting, is it?
Not now because of that, but they seem to have mended their ways. But now you get this new dimension coming out of Congress, or at least a few senators, that Snowden had been all along a Russian spy.
Right.
It's kind of defamation. I am not a supporter or an opponent of Snowden, but it seems to me the statement he issued saying it was completely untrue. The NSA, the FBI, and the CIA have all said they have no evidence that he was anyone's spy, that their evidence points to a loner. But what he went on to say is he was shocked not only that the senators would say this, but that credible Western American news media would report it as serious fact, or at least as serious possible.
Mike Rogers, Chair, House Intelligence. Mike McCall, Chair, House Homeland Security. Very powerful part of the national security apparatus.
It is very, very important to see this. What do you have in the Senate? This is Democrats and Republicans. An attempt to put new sanctions on Iran, which would wreck the negotiations with Iran. An attempt to further discredit Assad, to stop this opening for peace talks in Syria. And growing suspicion of Russian motives in Sochi. It is all a movement which I warned you weeks, if not months ago, we would see, that you always see when there's a possibility of new, expanded American-Russian relations. And that's why I say again, this is Obama's decisive moment. He either leads in the direction that he must know is the right direction, or he bends.
A proverb, Steve, from the Japanese, 1941, but it applies. Yeah. In any relationship between two states, a proposed alliance, there is a donkey and there is a rider. So the question, who's the rider and who's the donkey in the conversation between the two presidents this morning?
Well, I would answer with Goethe, who said something similar in a different way. A leader is either an anvil or a hammer. An anvil or a hammer. I think it's fair to say that Putin has had an excellent season as a leader in the last months of 2013.
Yes.
But the interests are so mutual. The American-Russian interests are so mutual, from Syria and Iran to the Olympics, that a failure of cooperation will be a defeat for both countries and therefore for both Obama and Putin. There's not going to be a winner here. This constant analysis of who's winning, and we can't allow Putin to win, is detrimental to American
Professor Steve Cohen, New York University, Russian history, the threat of sanctions, not in Iran, but in Kiev from the West. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show.